National upheaval from the pandemic and the outcry over policing is coming to roost locally on the city's budget cycle. Reforms have been advanced by Mayor Walsh and city councilors, but a majority of the council wants to go farther with changes in funding and policy, even as far as policing reimagined. To detail what that could mean is the chair of the Committee on Public Safety and district councilor for parts of Dorchester and Mattapan, Andrea Campbell. Thank you very much for being with us, Councilor.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for having me.
Council, over the years, we have seen changes locally in Boston that come after a local crisis. And I go back more than 30 years, the Stewart case, but
Mm.
we're going through a national moment here. What do you see that seems different right now?
I think, what is different is the level of civic engagement and the activism that we're seeing, not only across every neighborhood, but amongst our young people in particular. So I have been reviewing thousands of emails with respect to policing reforms and other reforms that residents want to see. I've also been receiving lots of calls. So just the level of engagement is off the charts. And it's a beautiful thing. Obviously in the face of such tragedy, it's great to see people pushing for change within our own communities.
Well, there's one term that certainly interests me that you and a lot of your colleagues in the council have subscribed to, and that is policing reimagined. To start with, the role of police or who's cast in different roles, what do you see?
So I think it's really important to, whether it is defunding, which is sort of the term folks are using, that I, along with many of my constituents, do not take that to mean that we want to abolish or get rid of our police department. Obviously, in my district, which is largely Mattapan and Dorchester, we still are seeing incidents of violence, domestic violence, homicides, and so our police are responding in a great way. The question before us is, how do we make this system, the policing system, our police department, more transparent, more accountable, more diverse, and racially just, so that we do not get an incident like George Floyd, that we do not continue to see certain communities or certain population of folks, namely Black residents, disproportionately policed. So I think although we are excellent, we can always do better, and there are reforms on the table to push for this department to be more transparent and accountable to the residents.
Well, what we've certainly seen nationally is some of the worst things have happened with some things that are otherwise very low on the criminal spectrum. It could be, someone who's had too much to drink, someone who has a mental health crisis. What kind of rethinking about the police mission should go with that?
So on the one hand, we're looking at how do we get at the root causes of violence in the first place? How do we address poverty? How do we address poor housing stock, lack of green space, lack of access to mental health supports? So right now we're talking about redirecting portions of the police budget to get at those root causes. And I think that's incredibly important. That's one way to reimagine our policing system. The other is looking at being transparent. Whether it's the stop and frisk data that I had a subpoena from our police department, we should never have to subpoena information that should live in the public realm. So pushing for a public safety dashboard that includes not only that data, but traffic stops, our budget numbers, anything that is relevant to the conversation. Accountability. We have had cases in my district, including some recent ones, and by an elderly resident who felt like she was racially profiled and has yet to have an adequate response from our police department. So right now we have the co-op board, which I want to make a civilian review board to allow for greater accountability for our civilians to be able to go through a process if they have complaints, but also for our officers to be able to go through some process to weed out those officers that are just not doing well on the job. And in addition to that, we're talking about demilitarizing our police force, diversifying our police force, which is still predominantly white and male. I've been pushing a report that I wrote 2.5 years ago. So a lot of these reforms that have been at the table and on the table and solutions have been a part of the conversation for a really long time. It's sad that we are now beginning to see movement in the face of such tragedy, not only with George Floyd, but Breonna Taylor. So this is the time to move on all those things. And in terms of other ways to reimagine, direct 911 calls. We've been talking about that for quite a bit too. And say, should everyone call 911 if they have a mental health issue, if they have some sort of issue that can be resolved in a more efficient and appropriate way by another department? So that right now is a topic of discussion as well.
Well, there's long been a debate about the norm of internal affairs investigating complaints against police because there's a risk of departmental bias. It's hard to break through the code of silence among police officers, but what can you do more externally, and that's still fair?
That's right. So we need an apparatus, whether you call the civilian review board or the co-op panel, which isn't doing it right now. We need an apparatus that is truly independent. It should not live within the police department. It should not be overseen by the commissioner. So if a group of panelists or civilians with experts from the law enforcement space who are overseeing these complaints and cases through a process, and they come to a conclusion that there was some wrongdoing, and they have the ability, and they should have the ability and the authority to put forth penalties and to enforce those. They shouldn't have to get sign off from the police commissioner or approval by the department. So that independence is so critically important. We currently don't have that, so pushing for that. Subpoena power, investigative power is critically important too. How do we allow for this entity to be able to get records, access to records, call witnesses, do all the things you need to do to get to the bottom of a case. And I think we also need to think about it, not just from the civilian perspective, but officers who want to report the bad apples, right? Right now, how do we talk about this apparatus supporting them? What does whistleblower protections look like? So there are a lot of things I think we need to be talking about in order to make sure that this accountability exists and that it's separate and apart from the police department, which is critically important.
What about the makeup of the police force? There has long been underrepresentation of people of color and a very strong influx of veterans, which some people really want to keep. So how would you rework that?
So, right now as the department is predominantly white and male. And we know that diversity is not only important to add value to the decisions being made, to build trust between a community and a department, regardless of what department that is in the city, but particularly in the context of policing, diversity is critical in shifting the culture within a department. And we know that is really important in the context of what we're talking about across this country. And right now we have to do a lot more to increase the number of men and women. I mean, I put out a report over 2 years ago, with 10 specific recommendations. Civilian or civil service, we definitely have to evaluate. Right now, that process is not entirely equitable to women and people of color who are trying to join. And so it continues to be a conversation. We need more than a conversation, we need action. And that report I put out has specific steps on how we eliminate barriers to entry and hiring, and also to promotional opportunities for those who are currently within the department.
Right now, a lot of the counselors are talking about something like a 10% funding shift. We have 7 days before the end of the budget cycle here. Can you really do all this in one fiscal year?
So we take a vote on Wednesday, tomorrow. And so I've been in a lot of conversations. I think everything is possible, right? I mean, I think for far too long, we have been putting forth ideas and solutions. I have written reports that have been formed by advocates and folks who've been working for a really long time. And people are tired of advocating and not seeing those solutions become reality. And so now the momentum is there. I think people are not willing to accept no. So there is a lot we can do to shift. Some of it has to be in the short term, some of it over a long-term strategy. I do think we can do more with the overtime budget. I do think that we can be pulling more resources there to allow that budget to continually go down while the Health Commission and other violence prevention and other resources go up. And so I'm excited for that conversation. And of course, pushing the mayor to come out with more specifics as to what he wants to do as well.
Finally, I want to ask you about the notorious photo of Police Commissioner William Gross and U.S. Attorney General William Barr. This was taken within a day or two after a collaboration on a big gang bust in Boston, in which the federal government helped out. Given that context, how bad was that photo?
That photo was awful. And the context is this. In this country, we are talking about Black men and women being brutally murdered by police. There is such pain, trauma, collective trauma. If you saw the George Floyd video, we're all traumatized by that. And to invite that particular gentleman at this time in this context when folks distrust police and law enforcement. And an attorney general who has proven that he is not for the spirit of the law, he is undermining the Department of Justice in so many ways. I just thought the timing was terribly wrong. And what was more frustrating is there are advocacy organizations, whether it's Lawyers Committee or ACLU, other organizations that want to meet with our commissioner, but have not received an opportunity to do that. And so to stand with Attorney General Barr when we're rejecting other folks, I thought is really troubling, particularly when communities of color, immigrant communities have such distrust of that particular attorney general, of that department, and what he's doing to undermine this country and this democracy. So I made that clear to the commissioner. It's not about listening to other perspectives. He could have done that via telephone, but imagery matters as people are traumatized and trying to channel their anger and their pain into productive action. We don't necessarily need to be triggering more of that. And I said to the mayor directly, it is for me the equivalent of him standing with Donald Trump, who is creating such divisiveness right now in this country. That timing does sometimes matter, and I don't think it's the best time for that. And I hope that he does meet with the advocacy organizations so that we can push for these policing reforms as a collective.